He hired a housekeeper for his new home, and opened the door to his ex standing there with 3 little girls who looked exactly like him. Nothing in his life prepared him for that moment. Alex Rivers stood alone in the entry hall of his new house, scrolling through messages while the silence pressed in from every direction. The space around him was immaculate: high ceilings, pale stone floors, walls still carrying the faint scent of fresh paint, but it felt hollow, as if the house was waiting for something it hadn't yet received. He had built entire neighborhoods, negotiated contracts worth millions, and moved through life with calculated precision, yet this place, meant to be a reward, felt empty. That was why he had called for a housekeeper. Order, he told himself, was the first step toward making a place feel lived in. When the doorbell rang, Alex barely glanced up, already expecting a stranger from an agency carrying a clipboard and polite professionalism. He opened the door without hesitation, and time seemed to fracture. Standing on the doorstep was Sophie, his ex. Her blonde hair was pulled back simply, a few loose strands framing a face he had once memorized in the dark. Her blue eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she masked the surprise, though it was clear she hadn't expected to see him either. She looked different, tired in a way that came from responsibility rather than age, but undeniably the same woman he had walked away from 5 years earlier. Alex's breath caught before he could stop it, memories flooding back with unwelcome clarity. Then he noticed the movement beside her. 3 little girls stood in a careful line, each no older than 5, holding small cleaning cloths and plastic buckets as if they were part of a serious mission. They were identical in a way that felt almost surreal. Dark hair fell neatly around their faces, and when the first girl looked up at him, Alex felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. Blue eyes. His blue eyes. The second girl tilted her head, studying him with quiet curiosity, and the third clutched Sophie's sleeve, peeking out from behind her mother with cautious interest. Alex's heart began to pound so loudly he was sure they could hear it. He had seen his reflection countless times, but never multiplied, never staring back at him with such innocent intensity. "Mom," one of the girls whispered, her voice soft but clear, "is this the house?" Sophie swallowed, her grip tightening on the handle of the cleaning bag she carried. "Yes," she answered gently, then lifted her gaze to Alex again. "Alex, I didn't know this was your address. The job came through an agency." Her voice was calm, professional, as though this were just an awkward coincidence rather than a collision of past and present. Alex struggled to form words, his mind racing through explanations that made no sense and possibilities he wasn't ready to face. He forced his gaze away from the girls and back to Sophie, though every instinct pulled him toward them. "You can, come in," he finally said, stepping aside automatically. As they crossed the threshold, the girls' eyes widened at the size of the house, their whispers filling the space with a sound it had never known. One of them brushed her fingers along the wall, another peered down the hallway, and the third looked up at Alex again, her expression thoughtful, as if she were trying to place him in a story she didn't yet understand. Sophie set her bag down near the door, her movements controlled but tense. She avoided his eyes, focusing instead on giving the girls quiet instructions to stay close and behave. Alex stood frozen, the weight of an unspoken truth pressing against his chest. Finally, unable to hold it back any longer, he asked in a low voice, "Sophie, are they?" She closed her eyes briefly, then met his gaze with a steady resolve that stole the air from his lungs. "Yes," she said softly. "They're yours." The words echoed through the vast, empty house, filling every corner with a truth that shattered the life Alex thought he understood. As the girls looked up at him again, 3 perfect reflections of something he had never known he'd lost, he realized that nothing about his future would ever be simple again. Alex felt as though the walls of the house were closing in on him, even though the rooms were vast and filled with light. The girls moved past him with cautious curiosity, their small footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor as they followed Sophie deeper into the house. They whispered to one another, occasionally glancing back at him as if unsure whether he was part of the place or just another piece of furniture that happened to be standing still. Alex remained near the door for several seconds after it closed, his heart racing, his thoughts scattered, trying to catch up with the reality that had just been spoken aloud. Sophie straightened the straps of her bag and turned to face him, her expression composed but guarded. Years had taught her how to hide fear behind calm, and he recognized that armor immediately. "We should talk," she said quietly, lowering her voice so the girls wouldn't hear. "But not like this. Not in front of them." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course." She gestured toward the living room. "They can sit there for a moment. They're used to waiting." The casual way she said it cut deeper than anything dramatic could have. Used to waiting. Alex watched as Sophie guided the girls to the sofa, handing them a small pack of crayons and paper from her bag. They settled in quickly, close together, their heads almost touching as they began to draw, content in a way that spoke of routine and resilience. His chest tightened as he realized how often Sophie must have relied on small preparations like this to get through the day. When Sophie returned, she crossed her arms lightly, keeping a careful distance between them. "I didn't bring them here to surprise you," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I didn't even know it was your house until the door opened." "I believe you," Alex replied immediately. I need to understand." Her lips pressed together for a moment before she nodded. "Ask." He ran a hand through his dark hair, pacing once before stopping in front of her. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About them. About me being their father." "All along," Sophie answered without hesitation. "From the moment I found out I was pregnant." The words landed with heavy finality. Alex felt something crack inside him. "And you never thought to tell me?" She didn't flinch. "I thought about it every day. And every day I remembered the man who told me he wasn't ready for a family, who said he needed freedom and focus. You left, Alex. You made your choice." "I didn't know," he said quietly. "If I had known." She lifted a hand, stopping him gently but firmly. "Don't finish that sentence unless you're sure. Because back then, I needed certainty, not possibilities." Silence stretched between them, thick with years of unresolved emotion. From the living room came the sound of soft laughter as one of the girls showed her drawing to the others. Alex turned instinctively toward the sound, his gaze lingering longer than he intended. "They're incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie's expression softened for just a second. "They are." "What are their names?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the moment she had said them at the door. "Emma, Lily, and Nora," she replied. "In that order. They're triplets." The word sent a strange mix of awe and grief through him. "Triplets," he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "I missed everything." "Yes," Sophie said quietly. "You did." There was no accusation in her tone, only truth. Alex looked back at her, his eyes full of something raw and unguarded. "I can't change the past," he said. "But I want to be part of their lives now. I don't know what that looks like yet, and I won't pretend I deserve it, but I want to try." Sophie studied him carefully, searching his face for signs of arrogance or entitlement. Finding none, she sighed softly. "Wanting isn't enough," she said. "They're 5. They've grown up without you. I won't let you come in and out of their lives when it suits you." "I understand," he replied. "And if you give me the chance, I'll prove that I'm not here to disappear again." She hesitated, the weight of responsibility heavy in her eyes. "Then we do this carefully," she said. Slowly. With boundaries. And with honesty. He nodded without argument. Whatever you need. She turned back toward the living room, calling the girls gently. Finish up, sweethearts. We'll start cleaning soon. The girls looked up, curious, their blue eyes flicking between Sophie and Alex. One of them smiled shyly at him before returning to her drawing, and that small gesture struck him with surprising force. As Alex watched them, a realization settled deep in his chest, quiet but unshakable. This wasn't a meeting he could walk away from. It was the beginning of a responsibility he could no longer deny. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, suspended rhythm, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Sophie moved methodically from room to room, assigning the girls small tasks that were more symbolic than necessary, letting them wipe low shelves and straighten pillows while she handled the real work. Alex watched from a distance at first, unsure of his place, acutely aware that every step he took could feel intrusive. The girls, however, seemed far less uncertain. They stole glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking, whispering to one another and giggling softly, their curiosity steadily overcoming their caution. At one point, Emma wandered closer to him, holding up a cloth like a badge of honor. "We're helping Mama," she announced seriously. "I can see that," Alex replied gently, lowering himself slightly so he wasn't towering over her. "You're doing a great job." She smiled at that, clearly pleased, then ran back to her sisters to share the praise. The simplicity of the exchange unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. These were not abstract ideas or distant possibilities. These were children with voices, habits, pride, and trust that had been built without him. Sophie noticed the interaction from across the room, her expression tightening briefly before she forced herself to relax. She reminded herself that this moment had always been inevitable, that shielding the girls forever was neither possible nor fair. Still, watching Alex earn their smiles so effortlessly stirred a complicated mix of relief and fear inside her. When the girls were finally distracted with a game in the far room, Sophie approached Alex again, lowering her voice. "They don't know who you are to them," she said quietly. "To them, you're just the owner of the house. And that's how it needs to stay for now." "I won't confuse them," Alex replied immediately. "I promise." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good." They worked in parallel for a while after that, sharing the space without touching, without talking much, yet acutely aware of each other's presence. Alex rolled up his sleeves and helped where he could, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. He scrubbed surfaces, carried boxes, and followed Sophie's quiet instructions without question. The billionaire CEO reduced to simple labor might have shocked anyone who knew him, but to Alex, it felt grounding. Honest. Necessary. As evening approached, the girls grew tired, their energy fading into soft yawns and slower movements. Nora climbed onto the couch with a blanket, Lily leaned against Sophie's side, and Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing shapes with her finger on the rug. The house no longer felt empty. It felt unfamiliar in a different way, as if it were learning new sounds. Alex cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "You don't have to keep working," he said to Sophie. "I can reschedule. This is a lot." She shook her head. "No. It's fine. They're used to long days." The statement, simple as it was, carried an undertone that made his chest tighten again. Used to long days. Used to adapting. Used to making do. "I'd like to see them again," he said quietly. "If you'll allow it. Not here, if that's uncomfortable. Just, sometime." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, weighing the risk against the reality already unfolding. "One step at a time," she said at last. "We'll talk about it. After the test." Of course, he agreed. Whatever you decide. She nodded, then began gathering the girls' things. As they prepared to leave, Lily paused near the door and looked back at Alex, her head tilted thoughtfully. "This is a big house," she said. "It is," Alex replied. "It's kind of lonely," she added, with the blunt honesty only a child could manage. Before he could respond, Sophie gently ushered them outside, offering him a polite but distant goodbye. The door closed softly behind them, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Alex stood alone in the entryway long after they were gone, staring at the space they had filled so briefly. The house no longer felt empty in the same way. Now it felt unfinished. And for the first time since the moment he opened the door and saw 3 small faces looking back at him, Alex understood something with aching clarity. This wasn't just about the past catching up to him. It was about the future demanding to be rewritten. The night after Sophie and the girls left, Alex barely slept. The house that had once felt too quiet now felt unbearably loud in its silence, every room echoing with imagined footsteps and half-heard laughter. He lay awake replaying the afternoon over and over, analyzing every word, every glance, every small moment when one of the girls had looked at him with curiosity instead of fear. No boardroom negotiation had ever left him this unsettled. This was a problem he couldn't solve by strategy alone, and that terrified him. By morning, he had made a decision. If he was going to step into their lives in any real way, he needed certainty, not assumptions built on resemblance and instinct. He contacted a private medical service he trusted and requested a DNA test, insisting on discretion and independence. When the confirmation email arrived, he read it twice, feeling the weight of what he was about to uncover settle heavily in his chest. Sophie received his message later that day. She stared at her phone for a long moment before responding, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had known this request would come, had prepared herself for it long ago, yet it still stirred an unexpected tightness in her chest. Agreeing meant reopening wounds she had spent years carefully stitching closed, but refusing would only prolong the inevitable. They met at a small, neutral clinic 2 days later, far from Alex's new house and even farther from the life he usually inhabited. The girls stayed with a neighbor, and the absence of their voices made the waiting room feel strangely hollow. Sophie sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight but tense, while Alex paced slowly, stopping only when he caught himself doing it. "This doesn't change how I feel," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "About wanting to be there. I just need the truth." She nodded once. "I understand. I've always known the truth." The test itself was quick and impersonal, a sharp contrast to the emotional weight it carried. A few signatures, a brief explanation, a swab. That was all it took to potentially redraw the boundaries of 4 lives. When it was over, Sophie exhaled as though she had been holding her breath the entire time. "The results will come in a few days," the nurse said calmly. Outside, the air felt colder than either of them expected. They stood for a moment without speaking, the space between them filled with things neither knew how to say yet. "Whatever happens," Sophie said finally, her voice steady but quiet, "I won't let them be hurt. That's not negotiable." Alex met her gaze. "I wouldn't ask you to." They parted without drama, without promises, both carrying the same heavy uncertainty in different ways. Alex returned to his work, but the waiting gnawed at him, turning hours into restless stretches of time. He caught himself imagining the girls at breakfast, at bedtime, at school, imagining moments he had never lived but already mourned. Sophie, meanwhile, focused on routine with almost desperate determination. She kept the girls busy, took them to the park, helped with crafts, read stories, and answered their questions with gentle half-truths when they asked about the man in the big house. At night, after they were asleep, she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring into her tea, wondering whether hope was something she could afford to feel again. When the call finally came, it reached Alex first. He stood in his office, phone pressed to his ear, every sense sharpened. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, detached. "We have the results," the technician said. Alex closed his eyes, bracing himself. "They are not a match." For a moment, the words didn't register. When they did, they landed with a dull, disorienting force. He thanked the technician automatically and ended the call, standing motionless as the city moved outside his window. Relief should have followed. Closure should have come. Instead, something felt profoundly wrong. His instincts screamed in protest. The resemblance, the connection, the way the girls had gravitated toward him without knowing why, it all refused to be erased by a single sentence. He felt no release, only a growing suspicion that the truth had been interrupted, diverted, perhaps even stolen. That evening, when Sophie received his message telling her the results were negative, she closed her eyes slowly, a familiar ache spreading through her chest. She had expected this reaction from him, the doubt, the disappointment, the retreat that so often followed uncertainty. She hugged the girls a little tighter that night, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure were meant for them or herself. But Alex didn't retreat. Instead, as he sat alone in his silent house once more, a quiet resolve took shape. If the truth didn't align with what his heart already knew, then the truth had been touched by something else. And he intended to find out what. The days that followed were some of the heaviest Alex had ever lived through, not because of chaos, but because of restraint. He forced himself not to drive to Sophie's apartment, not to demand explanations, not to drag the past back into the open when the result had already done enough damage. Outwardly, his life continued as usual. Meetings resumed, contracts were signed, assistants moved in and out of his office with practiced efficiency. Inwardly, nothing was stable. The negative result sat in his mind like a foreign object his body refused to accept. What disturbed him most was not disappointment, but certainty. He had built an empire by trusting patterns, by noticing what others dismissed as coincidence, and nothing in this situation aligned with coincidence. 3 children, identical, with his eyes, his expressions, his mannerisms, appearing out of nowhere through the woman he had once loved, was not a statistical accident. The more he thought about it, the more the test result felt less like an answer and more like an interruption. Sophie felt the shift immediately, even without hearing from him again. The silence was familiar, cruel in its predictability. She told herself she should be relieved. The truth, as confirmed by science, should have closed the door cleanly. Yet every time she watched the girls sleep, their identical profiles lined up in quiet symmetry, something inside her rebelled. She had never lied to Alex. She had never doubted. And now she was being asked to doubt herself. A week later, the agency that had sent her to Alex's house called to apologize for an administrative error, informing her that the placement would be paused indefinitely. No explanation, no compensation, just a polite dismissal wrapped in professional language. Sophie understood immediately. Someone with money and influence had decided she was inconvenient. She didn't need to ask who. That night, as the girls slept, Sophie sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the DNA paperwork she had kept all these years, the original hospital records, the dates, the timelines. Everything aligned. Everything always had. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the papers back into their envelope. She wasn't afraid of the truth. She was afraid of what it would cost to defend it. Across the city, Alex was making a decision of his own. He contacted an independent laboratory overseas, one that had no contracts, no shared databases, no interest in local politics or favors. He paid for discretion, for redundancy, for multiple verification points, and requested that samples be collected again under strict supervision. This time, he did not involve Sophie. Not yet. He needed certainty before reopening a wound that had already bled enough. When the lab confirmed the procedure, Alex sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. This was not about proving Sophie wrong or right. This was about proving reality to himself. Days later, when Sophie opened her door to find Alex standing there again, she didn't hide her surprise or her exhaustion. She looked smaller somehow, worn thin by worry and responsibility. "I'm not here to argue," he said before she could speak. "And I'm not here to pressure you. I need to ask you something, and you can say no." She studied him carefully, searching for arrogance, for control, for the man who once chose ambition over commitment. What she saw instead unsettled her. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "I want to do another test," he said. "Independent. Transparent. One you can oversee." Silence stretched between them. From inside the apartment came the soft sound of one of the girls turning in her sleep. "You already have an answer," Sophie said finally. "I have a result," Alex replied. "That's not the same thing." Her eyes filled, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Hope. "If this hurts them," she said slowly, "I will never forgive you." He nodded. "I wouldn't forgive myself either." After a long moment, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Then we do it properly," she said. "For the last time." As Alex crossed the threshold again, the house filled once more with a truth that refused to stay buried. Somewhere deep inside him, beneath doubt and fear and consequence, a quiet certainty remained unshaken. The story was not finished. It had only reached the point where lies could no longer survive. The second test was handled with a precision that left no room for doubt. An independent medical team arrived at Sophie's apartment early in the morning, their presence calm, professional, and deliberately distant from any familiar system. Samples were taken from Alex and the girls separately, documented meticulously, sealed, and transported under supervision. Sophie watched every step with unwavering focus, her jaw tight, her arms folded as though holding herself together. She had agreed to this for one reason only: to end the uncertainty once and for all, no matter the outcome. After the team left, the apartment felt unusually quiet. The girls sensed the tension even if they didn't understand it, clinging closer to Sophie than usual, their usual chatter subdued. Alex stayed longer than planned, helping prepare lunch, reading to them, answering their questions about why strangers had come to visit. He kept his explanation simple, careful not to cross the boundaries Sophie had set, yet every small interaction reinforced the bond he could no longer deny. When he finally left, the waiting began again. This time, however, Alex did not allow himself to drift into distraction. He confronted the unease directly, replaying every inconsistency, every moment that had followed the first test. His suspicions narrowed, sharpening into something dangerously close to certainty. He began quietly investigating the original laboratory, tracing connections, uncovering financial ties that had no place in a supposedly neutral process. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. Influence had been applied. Results had been altered. Sophie, meanwhile, moved through her days with fragile composure. She kept the girls' routines intact, answered their questions with soft smiles, and held herself together through sheer will. At night, when the apartment finally fell silent, fear crept in. Not fear of the truth, but fear of what the truth might change. Hope, once awakened, was difficult to contain. The call came on a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with rain. Alex was in his office when his phone rang, the unfamiliar number making his heart pound before he even answered. The voice on the other end was clear, direct, and devoid of ambiguity. "The results are conclusive," the technician said. "All 3 children are biologically yours. The probability exceeds 99.9%. Alex closed his eyes as the word settled, his chest tightening with a mix of vindication and grief. He had been right. And being right had a cost. He thanked the technician, ended the call, and sat in silence for several long moments, pressing his fingers to his temples as years of absence collapsed into a single, unbearable truth. He didn't wait. He drove straight to Sophie's apartment, the rain blurring the city into streaks of gray. When she opened the door and saw his expression, she knew before he spoke. Her breath caught, and she had to steady herself against the doorframe. "It's you," she whispered. "All of them." "Yes," Alex said, his voice unsteady. "I'm their father." The words felt different spoken aloud, heavier, permanent. Sophie covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now, years of restraint dissolving in an instant. The girls appeared behind her, drawn by the sudden shift, their identical faces looking up at him with quiet curiosity. He knelt instinctively, bringing himself to their level. "Hi," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I'm Alex." Emma tilted her head. "You were here before." "Yes," he said, swallowing hard. "And I'm going to be here again." They didn't fully understand, but they felt the sincerity. Nora stepped forward first, reaching out to touch his sleeve as if to confirm he was real. Lily followed, then Emma, their small hands warm and trusting. Alex's vision blurred as the weight of that trust settled onto his shoulders. Behind them, Sophie watched, her heart aching in a way that was no longer just pain. This was the truth she had carried alone for 5 years, finally seen, finally shared. Later that evening, as the girls played quietly nearby, Alex showed Sophie the documentation, the signatures, the safeguards that had prevented interference this time. He told her what he had discovered about the first test, the connections, the quiet manipulation. She listened without shock, only a deep, weary understanding. "I knew something was wrong," she said softly. "I just didn't know how to fight it." "You don't have to anymore," Alex replied. "I will." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean. Inside, something just as powerful was happening. The truth had arrived. And this time, it was impossible to erase. The days that followed shifted into a new rhythm, fragile at first, then slowly finding their balance. Alex didn't announce his place in the girls' lives with declarations or demands. He showed up quietly, consistently, letting his presence speak for him. He came in the mornings with bags of groceries and left in the evenings after helping with homework sheets that were mostly drawings and half-formed letters. He learned quickly that Emma needed reassurance, Lily needed encouragement, and Nora needed time before offering trust, while Sophie needed space to breathe and watch without feeling pressured. Sophie observed everything with a careful eye. She didn't interfere, but she didn't retreat either. She noticed how Alex listened when the girls spoke, how he didn't correct them harshly or rush them, how he apologized when he made mistakes. She saw him struggle with bedtime routines and laugh at his own clumsiness, saw how he sat on the floor during playtime rather than towering above them. These were small things, but they were the kinds of details she had learned to measure people by. One evening, as they sat around the small kitchen table eating dinner, Emma suddenly looked up at Alex with open curiosity. "Why do you have the same eyes as us?" she asked, her voice matter-of-fact. The room went still. Sophie's breath caught, and Alex felt the weight of the moment press against his chest. He met Emma's gaze, then glanced briefly at Sophie, who gave a subtle nod. "Because I'm your dad," Alex said gently. "I wasn't here before, and that was my mistake. But I'm here now." The girls absorbed the words in silence. Lily reached for Sophie's hand instinctively, while Nora studied Alex with serious intensity. "You're staying?" Nora asked quietly. Yes, he replied without hesitation. I'm staying. That was all it took. There were no tears, no dramatic reactions, only a quiet acceptance that settled over the table like a natural truth. Later that night, Lily asked him to read a story, Emma insisted he help with her puzzle, and Nora carefully placed her toy next to him on the couch, as if marking space he was allowed to occupy. After the girls were asleep, Sophie and Alex stood together in the hallway, the soft glow of the night light spilling across the floor. The tension between them felt different now, no longer sharp but delicate, like something that could either heal or break depending on how it was handled. I'm still afraid, Sophie admitted quietly. Not of you. Of the past repeating itself. Alex nodded. I'm afraid too. But I'm more afraid of losing them than of changing my life. She studied him, searching for uncertainty, for hesitation. Finding none, she let out a slow breath. Then this has to be about them first. Not us. I agree, he said. Whatever happens between you and me can wait. The honesty in his answer surprised her. For the first time since he walked back into her life, she felt something loosen inside her chest. In the weeks that followed, Alex made choices that confirmed his words. He reduced his workload, delegated responsibilities he once guarded fiercely, and declined projects that would pull him away for long periods. The board questioned him. Colleagues whispered. He didn't care. One afternoon, as they walked together to the park, Nora slipped her small hand into his without thinking. Alex froze for a split second, then relaxed, letting the moment settle naturally. Sophie watched from a few steps behind, her heart aching with a mixture of pain and gratitude. That evening, as the girls fell asleep sprawled across the couch after a long day of laughter, Sophie sat beside Alex in the quiet that followed. Neither spoke for a long time. You're really here, she said finally. Yes, he replied. And I'm not going anywhere. She nodded slowly, allowing herself, at last, to believe it might be true. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like something Sophie had to face alone. The transformation of their lives did not arrive with fireworks or grand announcements. It came quietly, settling into ordinary days that slowly became something extraordinary. Alex found himself waking earlier than ever before, not for meetings or flights, but for breakfast at a small kitchen table where three identical faces argued about cereal choices and laughed at their own jokes. The house that once felt too large and too empty began to feel exactly the right size, filled with sound, movement, and warmth. Sophie no longer carried the weight of everything alone. She still moved with caution, still protected her daughters fiercely, but the constant tension in her shoulders softened as Alex continued to show up without conditions. He attended parent meetings, learned the names of teachers, memorized favorite snacks, and never once treated these moments as interruptions to something more important. Slowly, she allowed herself to lean back instead of bracing forward, to trust that this time was different. The girls adapted with the effortless resilience of children. They spoke about their father naturally, without drama, as though he had always been part of the story and had simply arrived a little late. Emma liked to sit beside Alex and ask endless questions, Lily preferred holding his hand in public, and Nora watched quietly, offering her affection in careful, deliberate gestures. Each connection formed in its own time, and Alex respected every pace. One afternoon, months later, the four of them stood in Alex's once empty house, now scattered with toys, drawings taped to the refrigerator, and shoes abandoned near the door. Sophie walked through the space slowly, taking in how completely it had changed. It no longer felt like a showcase or a reward. It felt like a home. Alex joined her by the window, watching the girls chase one another across the backyard, their laughter carrying easily through the open door. I spent years building things that looked impressive from the outside, he said quietly. I never realized how fragile they were until I almost lost what actually mattered. Sophie turned to him, her expression calm and steady. "You didn't lose it," she said. "You came back in time." He met her gaze, understanding the weight of that truth. "Only because you were strong enough to hold everything together until I could." She didn't look away this time. The past still existed between them, but it no longer defined them. What stood in its place was something quieter, more deliberate, built on choice rather than assumption. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft gold and blue, the girls ran back inside, breathless and smiling, pulling both Alex and Sophie into their excitement. Hands linked naturally, laughter filled the space, and for a moment everything aligned without effort. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep in a tangled pile of blankets and stuffed animals, Sophie and Alex sat together in the living room, the lights low, the house finally still. There were no dramatic promises, no declarations meant to seal the future. There didn't need to be. They had already chosen it. In the quiet that followed, Alex understood something with absolute clarity. The greatest success of his life would never be measured in wealth, influence, or recognition. It was measured in presence, in patience, and in the courage to return when it mattered most. And this time, he wasn't leaving.